Am I going to be teaching? When is he going to be teaching?
He's not. He has a commitment at Fayetteville to teach there on, no, Avondale to teach there on Thursday.
Okay.
So that's part of the reason. And whenever I was discussing this with him, for some reason or other, I got that. But then whenever I put it down on the website, I messed everything up. So again, please forgive me in that respect.
Okay, brother.
It shows I'm a human being, I guess.
Yes.
And that's it's the thing about it is the older I get, it seems like I'm making more and more of these mistakes, and that gets a little bit more frustrating. Don't know what that is.
That's why I try to get all my mistakes out of the way.
Well, good. I hope you do. Let me know how that works out for you, because I've not been able to work that out.
I help you.
Yeah. So it's two people over there. So I said, you over here by yourself. So I come over here to help fill the class out.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
How many students Matt have?
I guess just my one.
Okay.
Well, he's got some online as well, so hopefully we'll turn this off one time and then go right back on and try this one more time. And if it don't work, we won't go over the syllabus. I'll let Dave go over the syllabus next week, okay? But you've already got the syllabus. You're older gentlemen, so you're going to be able to know exactly what you need to be doing anyway. Just do what he asks you to do and go from there, okay? Tonight we're going to just start with lesson 1 and talk about some very simply the ideal of preliminary thoughts about preparing and delivering sermons. How many of you have ever preached before?
I have.
You have? Okay. What kind of, what are your feelings about what you've done and how you've done in times past? Hold on just a moment. Okay.
And so we were going to take Revelation. We took Revelation with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I decided to take that again because I like Randy's teaching style.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes
That's why we were going. That's why we were taking math classes because we were he's teaching.
So, like I said, what were your experiences as you've preached before? What's been your experiences so far?
Well, for me, to critique myself, I need to, not that I don't know the material, but study the material more so I can do it from memory.
Mm-hmm.
Eye contact with the audience.
Right.
Speech, pronunciation of words, and speed.
And speed. What do you mean?
Sometimes you amped up and it's just like, calm down.
Okay. All right. So a lot of the things that every speaker has a problem with is that ideal of speed. I don't know, sometimes whenever I'm speaking, a lot of times, I wind up going too fast. But that's just a natural thing. And I absolutely have to tell myself, slow down. When you're preaching sermons and you've got a certain period of time, what is the length of time of a perfect sermon? You know, how long, you think about what we read about the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 through 7, how long will it take to read through that? What is it? You know, reading it at a pace that like you would preach it, like you would stand up and preach that sermon. How long do you think Jesus spoke along that line? It's not a very long sermon, but boy, he unpacks everything. And how many thousands of sermons, perhaps millions of sermons, have been preached on the Sermon on the Mount since he did that. He was very concise. He got to the heart of the matter. My personal opinion, did you hear that? My personal opinion is that in that situation, he, from there on out, through the rest of the book of Matthew, he will keep coming back to things he has already referenced in the Sermon on the Mount. For example, in Matthew chapter 18, he talks about that whole chapter there about offenses and forgiving one another. And he had referenced that in Matthew chapter 6. Right after the quote, disciples' prayer, He says, for if we do not forgive men of their trespasses, our Heavenly Father will not forgive us of our trespasses. Matthew 19 goes back to his discussion in Matthew chapter 5 about marriage, divorce, and marriage. So it's one of those things that always he acts, to me, he comes back and really elaborates on it again in the book of Matthew in a lot more detail. So preaching sermons is tough. When you talk to people today about what is their greatest fear, most of them will tell you that it is the what?
Public speaking.
Why is that? Why is that so scary?
Well, because people are scrutinizing you.
Right.
You're pressured. You don't want to make a mistake. Because in preaching, you make a mistake, people will jump on you.
Well, that's true, and that's valid. But what is another problem? I think there's even more pressure sometimes in preaching sermons because we don't want to make a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to say something in a way that would discourage somebody, and we don't want to say it in a way that, sometimes the inflection of our voice or something like that may come across too harsh when we don't mean to be. So there's so much else involved in that too. We want to get it right, and we want people to walk out. I'm always looking for the perfect sermon, and I'm always looking for that where I bat 1,000. The problem is no preacher's going to do that. And we put this big, heavy expectation on us, and sometimes we get to the point, well, it just seems like we're not doing any good. And so we just decide then what? Just give up and quit. And that's not what God needs. That's not what God wants. So as we think about that idea, we realize that making sure that we develop sermons that are needed at that point in time. I've been at the congregation I've been at now for 27 years. That's South Cobb Church of Christ. And I sit down and think about the fact that it feels like, well, let me put it this way. I had a brother there at South Cobb years ago that mentioned this to me. He said, you've been here about 3 or 4 years now. He said, we pretty well heard everything you've got to say. And I'm sitting there, okay. And here I am now, into the 27th year, and I'm sitting there thinking to myself, that haunts me. I keep thinking to myself, well, then they've heard everything I've had to say now 10 or 12 times. As we're talking about it, they've heard everything I've got to say. So that's even that much more pressure. We don't want to come back to a sermon and rehash a sermon. Leftovers are good for how long? After a while, you just don't want the mashed potatoes anymore. They just get lumpy and everything like that. The same thing with sermons. We have problems as well as we think about it. First off, we're trying to learn to make speeches and make them interesting and get people to buy into them, to listen to them. Then we also have the deal that we're dealing with the most important subject in the world, man and man's salvation. And we want to make sure that we get it right to where people at least will listen to what God has to say. If we say something the wrong way or don't say it exactly the way they expect it, then they could just click. We're living in a culture today, let's also be honest about this, that keeping anybody's attention span for a period of 5 minutes, you become, it's somewhat, and please, I'm using this term not in the sense that we understand it in the Bible, but it's somewhat miraculous if you get somebody to pay attention to you for 10, 15 minutes. Why? Because every time we turn it around, we're looking at our cell phones, we're looking at everything else, and the attention span of most people today is absolutely nothing, nil. Then you have the challenge of getting their attention in the first few minutes and how to keep that attention all the way through the rest of the sermon. So everything that I'm talking about here does bring out the ideas of the problem with preaching, period. But it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those that believe. And so as a result of that, I need to give the very best I've got. We preachers as well, we spend a lot of time comparing ourselves with people. I'm not Dan Winkler. I'm not Tom Holland. I'm not some of these other well-known preachers in the Brotherhood. So we sit back and say, well, if I can't be that, then why bother? Or we sit back and say, well, you know, why do I even try? But again, we try to compare ourselves with people that have been doing it all their lives, maybe have been brought up in the church all their lives, maybe have had parents, fathers that were preachers.
Yeah,
you think about the Winkler brothers and so forth. I mean, their grandfather and then their father and then them are all preachers. And so you got all that. They've heard all of that. I became a member of the church, and none of my family was in the church. So, and I became a preacher. So all of those things come into play. There's not a time when I stand up before a group of people to preach God's word that I don't feel humbled, that I don't feel, that I sit back and think to myself, God, you could get some other person up here, but I'm the guy at the time, so use me. Use me the way you can. Mm-hmm. Now, some people, as I said, they just get to the point where they say, okay, that's it. I'm not even going to try. And the problem is with that, God needs preachers. He wants every one of us to be preachers. Some of us are better at one-on-one evangelism. Some of us are better as public speakers. But God, again, using 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14, the Spirit puts into the church, of course, there he's talking about the miraculous gifts, but he puts them there for that purpose and time. So to bring about the fullness of the body, he's still doing the same thing today, only not with miraculous words. Mm-hmm. Think about the ideal of preachers in the Old Testament. Even though what would it have been like for a few moments to think about Isaiah, listen to Isaiah preach? What would it have been like to hear Jesus preach? And we can sit back and think, well, he was the perfect human being, and everybody did flock to hear him. But you also remember the fact that what they flocked to hear him about, when he got down to the nitty-gritty about what Christianity is going to be like and following me, and in John chapter 6, eating of my flesh and drinking of my blood, what did they do? They turned around and walked off. And then he would even look at his disciples, the 12, and he said, well, you also go away. So again, it's the battle for men's hearts. We've got to do the very best we can to reach people's hearts, but at the same time, that means we've got to work at being, again, knowing what our sermons are and things along that line. Now, here again, I don't have the syllabus. I've been waiting to see if it happened to pop up. It didn't, so I'll have him go over that next week. I did have a copy somewhere, and I can't find it, so please forgive me for that. But again, you can read it just as well as I can. You'll see what your expectations are. Speaking is an art, not just a job, right? And so, if you're going to, some people have the talent, some people have to work harder to do it. That's the reality of it. But again, it's something that we need to continue to work at to be the best we can be at it. So as you think about it in that respect, there is such a thing as God-given ability. There's the ideal also of God using our ability, using what talents we have to bring glory and honor to him. As I said, not every one of us are Dan Winkler or Tom Holland or Franklin Camp or some of the other well-known preachers in the Brotherhood years ago who could stand up in an audience and say, what would you like me to preach on tonight? And somebody says, I'd like to hear a sermon on this. And they immediately go into a sermon about it, give you book, chapter, verses, everything in a precise, orderly manner. Very few people can do that. So we've got to work at it a little bit harder. One of my biggest things, as I said before, is after being at a place for 30-something years, it feels like sometimes I preach these things. And so many times, and I got to thinking to myself, and I heard, I think it was Willard Collins, made a statement one time before. He said, I never preached the same sermon twice. And I got to thinking to myself, wow, you mean every time he preached something different where, but I think what he was trying to say was he may have taken a sermon that he preached years ago, but he's still not going to preach it the same way now that he did then. So again, you've got the preacher's experiences that comes into it. So when a young man's starting out, that's one thing. When you've got a guy that's been doing it for 30, 40 years, when they know the brethren, when they know all the difficulties and the way people are, when they know and understand what people get upset about, and you're sitting there, first off, rejoicing in God's patience with us and realizing that I have to show the same patience to people that God shows to us, that all that comes into play there. Now, when we start thinking about the preparation and delivery of sermons, we have to understand that human nature wants order, right? Human nature does want order. The word cosmos, where we translate in the English as earth or the world, the word cosmos actually means orderly. So you think about the idea that this world is an ordered place. We've often used this to talk about and prove that God exists. We talk about the fact that we breathe out carbon dioxide, and the trees take in that carbon dioxide. What do they put out? Oxygen. Order. Everything is set up in order. When you get even on the microbiological level, nuclear level, you see those DNA strands. They're perfect order for whatever it is that cell is supposed to do. God's perfect order. And so we like order. We don't like disorder. Often whenever I'm at the church, I've got 15 things all stretched out over my desk, and I look and think about, okay, I've got all these things I need to take care of today, and I get frustrated because I've got so much, and then somebody will call or somebody will drop by and take an hour or 30 minutes to an hour and talk about something that's on their heart, which I'm not complaining about. They need maybe to get that across, but now I'm scrambling. And that's, I think, part of what happened with this preparation and delivery of sermon class. In the midst of all of that, I remember talking to Brother Dave that he couldn't be here on Thursday, but for some reason or another, I still scheduled the class on Thursday, and I was sitting there thinking, something's not right. Something's not quite right here. And then it dawned on me what it was today. So again, that's the idea. Why do we need to have order in sermons? Well, people remember a certain sermon in a certain way. Think about that in respect. We have order in a sermon because people like to think in that way. And you listen to a lot of preachers. A lot of this is going to be my philosophy on preaching, so in preparation and delivery of sermon. When you go to certain preacher schools, they will train you to do preparation and delivery in certain ways. So they will ask you to, a sermon, they will always say needs to have what?
Text.
Okay, you need to have text. What else?
Title.
All right.
Intro.
Introduction.
And then the discussion.
Then the discussion. And then you need to have, and everybody looks forward to this, the conclusion.
Conclusion, yeah.
Right. And usually, how do we end a sermon? Let's all stand and sing. Right? I mean, that's the go-to way to do it. Now, you think about that. So a lot of times, think about this whole idea of text for a moment. The way a lot of these preacher training schools train people, and I'm not complaining nor am I fussing about this. I want it to be clearly understood, but I don't think this way. And I don't know many people that do, but sometimes during the discussion part, they would usually say what? You need to have 2 to 3 points, 2 to 3 main points, then what? Then your sub-points. And you'll learn all this when it talks about the different kind of sermons. You've got topical sermons, you've got exegetical sermons, you've got textual sermons, you've got sermons that are narrative. So he'll go talk about all from there. You have 2 or 3 main points. And so what they'll do is they will, in every one of these points, they'll start the point off with the same letter.
Yeah.
You know, I can't think of an example right off the top of my head, but I cannot tell you how many times I have read sermons and gone through sermons like that, to where every one, like if the first point starts with the letter P, everything else is going to be starting with the letter P from there on out. That probably does help some people in memory, okay? But I don't think that way. And so I don't really develop sermons like that. Sometimes I think, and let me go ahead and say this, sometimes we take texts and make the text fit these things. And that to me, again, what am I stressing here? I'm stressing this is me. I'm not going to complain nor judge anybody that does it a different way. I'm not going to do that.
Well, from my experience, you got the 3 P's, to try to make the text fit those 3, like propitiation and the other 2 P's, and you may take the first point and easy take out of the text.
Right.
Then the second point, okay, it's a little harder. But by the time you get to that third point, you really trying to stretch to match all those up.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I took this class again, which I took it before with Richie, is another perspective.
Right.
To see, okay, another way, because from one teacher to another, it's not concrete.
Right.
So it's good to be versatile and get different approaches. So that's one of the reasons. But the 3 points or something, and that drives me crazy. So for me, it has to be an easier way to outline my sermon.
Right.
Because it's the 3 points.
Because you don't want to water it down just so that it fits letters.
Yeah, and again, that's where the problem comes in. I think sometimes we force the text to fit this, and to me, that's wrong. That's just to me. That's wrong. We can't force the text to do something that it's not naturally going to do.
Then there's the thing also with the 3 points, to try to think of 3 words that blend together with the ending or ION ending, propitiation.
Yeah, right. Preparation, propitiation.
Yeah,
you're right.
Cooperation.
Yeah. And you can say that of all that. Now, again, I'm not going to condemn that, but I have, in some of the reading that I've done, I've read through a lot of folks that do this kind of thing, and to me, they've really stretched a lot of those points to make it work. And I understand why they're doing it. I can't. I personally can't. So the bottom line is, think about also another thing that's going on as we preach today, as we talk about the preaching event. Here's what happens on a Sunday morning. The song leader hopefully has done some preparation. At South Cobb, the song leaders that work with me, they asked me before, what are you going to be preaching on? What can we talk? And sometimes the song's going to easily fit. Sometimes they're not. If I preach a sermon on the Lord's Supper, they can find 15 songs to take care of that. We'll sing all the Lord's Supper songs at that time. But if I talked about the sin of adultery, you're not going to find any songs that's going to fit that. You know what I'm trying to say? So you got that issue. A lot of times in some churches, the guy gets in there, he doesn't even know he's going to lead singing to begin with. He stands up and says, oh, you got to lead singing. Okay, so he's scrambling through the book trying to figure out whatever he finds. Now, lack of preparation does show very quickly amongst any congregation. So if a guy's just rushed up there to sing songs just because we're supposed to sing songs without any thought given to it beforehand, you've got that problem. So the congregation, and again, I think about this in a preaching event, in a worship event. If the singing is laggy, and you know what I mean by that, slow songs, then everybody, dare I say it, everybody's pretty well asleep before we even get up there to preach. Okay, so then what happens is this, the preacher then has to work that much harder to get people's attention and keep going with it. Nowadays, we use PowerPoint. So again, one of those things is that takes a little bit more time. Part of the reason why we do that is because people, if they see it, if they hear it and then they see it, hopefully it sticks better. At South Cobb, I do PowerPoint. I also pass out in the bulletins every week a sermon outline sheet. So I've got big points where they fill in the blank. So they're writing it down, they're seeing it, they're hearing it. I'm praying fervently that they walk out the door with it. And then through the event, through this thing, a lot of people are thinking about supper or lunch. They're thinking about the baby that's in front of them that's so cute. They're thinking about how their joints are hurting. Some of them worked very hard the Saturday before, and they are just literally there, and they're fighting it with everything they've got because they're so exhausted. You've got all of this to fight against. So it really is, think about it, it becomes a very big, and it becomes hard to do every week.
Also, when you get in the pulpit and you start seeing people falling asleep, then you start questioning yourself. Am I boring?
Mm-hmm.
And you don't, when you're sitting out in the hall, you don't see it. But when you get up there, you see everything. You're like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, wow, you know, it's a different viewpoint.
Right.
And,
It is.
oh, okay, there's people out in the office. You're like, oh, it must be boring.
Well, there's one brother that I can think of right now that went to sleep during every sermon I preached. Okay. But the brother also was having some major medical issues. He was taking a lot of medicine. I cut him, he was there. Now, how much was he getting? I don't know. That's between him and God. You know what I'm trying to say? So you've got this going on. So we try to the best of our ability to organize a lesson in such a way to where people will walk out remembering what was said and what, more importantly, I've seen us do this sometimes. We do the title of the text, the intro to the discussion, and when we come to the conclusion, one of the biggest problems I see a lot of times, and I have been forcing myself to do this, there's guys at the church there, South Cobb, that have really pushed me along this line, and I really appreciate it, and they don't even know it, but they will always say, what's the takeaway? What can I take home?
Application.
What's the application? And a lot of times people will preach wonderful sermons. We can preach against about the sin of instrumental music and using instrumental music, and it needs to be preached, and people need to hear it. But what's the application? Well, everybody in the church, pretty well, if you're in the Church of Christ, they're going to agree with you anyway. They say, okay, I've heard that sermon before. But one of the points that I think needs to be made is, okay, why do people feel like they have to have an instrument? Well, I also worked for a while at a funeral home. I heard a lot of funeral sermons. All right, I helped bury bodies. All right, so the bottom line is as I was doing that, I got to thinking about and listening to the songs that were sung in these funeral sermons, but the application. What is the application all about? All right, what are you going to take home? Again, every sermon, or a lot of the sermons that I heard preached in funerals, everybody makes it to heaven. I ain't seen nobody yet that's been preached into hell. Never, ever, 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 you know. And you're never going to see that. And don't misunderstand me, that's not the time nor the place. You talk about eternity, you try to encourage the people that are there. You get them to make the application. Yeah, this child or your son was 19 years old. He was taken in an automobile accident. We don't know when death's coming. That's a tough point right there during the funeral. But whenever you're talking about, okay, let's talk about again about instrumental music. We see the sin in it, and we agree with the preacher, amen, and we're not going to do it. But how should that change our singing? I've made the statement at South Cobb that I believe, this is my opinion, again, do you hear that? I want to make sure that, but I always emphasize this. If God had wanted us to use instrumental music, he would have demanded it of all of us. Every person should have been playing whatever it was. And then I went to go ahead and made the statement that God knows that not everybody can play an instrument, but God also knows that we all can sing. We may not sing very well, but we all can sing. And so there's that part of it. And so when I'm teaching a sermon on, say, instrumental music, everybody I know will agree with me to begin with, but now, what's the application? Okay, brethren, we need to make our singing to where when people come in here, they don't even see the need for an instrument. They don't need to see the need for that. I've heard sisters tell me before, well, I can't sing very well, so I don't sing. And I just smile and say, well, then you're not worshiping. True or false? You know, I mean, that's the bottom line. So that's all part of it. So this is what we're talking about. You know, the order of the sermon. You got, like you said, you got this title, the text. May I always suggest you start with the text, you live the text, you breathe the text, you understand the text, you think about how the text is applying to your life. Always make the application there first. That's where it all starts. Then the points then start coming easier. Deal with the discussion. Come up with your main points. Then you write your introduction. Then you write your conclusion. And then after it's all said and done, you come up with a title for the thing. So that's the way to do it. And that's the way a lot of folks do it. There has to be order. The beginning should prepare the way for the middle and the conclusion. One brother said it this way. Tell them what you're going to say it. Then at the conclusion, tell them what you said. They've heard it 3 times now. That's the point. Too many points weaken the whole sermon. 3 points a lot of times are good enough. A speech should progress. Think about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount again. Again, Jesus gave us that sermon, but what is, everybody turn to Matthew 5 through 7. Let's look at that real quick. What do you think is the main theme of the sermon? Now, we've all heard sermons on it. We've heard sermons on it so many times. So let's look at it real quick. Let's look at this sermon for a few minutes and see the main point.
I would say that the character of the believer.
Okay. And a lot of times, that's the way a lot of people are defining this, Matthew 5 through 7, the character of the believer or what God wants in his disciples. That's a very good point. But if you were to look at this entire sermon and pick out what the theme of it is, what would you say is the theme? What would you say is the main point that Jesus is trying to get at in this entire sermon in Matthew chapter 5 through 7?
Let's see.
How to be a Christian.
How to be a Christian or how to be a disciple. Very good.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want you to stop for just a moment. As we're thinking about this, think about the context. You're right, he is talking about how to be a disciple and how to be a Christian. But at this time, there were no Christians. So who is he talking to in this sermon? Now remember that. Think about that application for a moment. Who is he preaching to in this sermon?
Well, we can say Jews.
He's preaching to the Jews. Very, very good. And we know that because he emphasizes that. Now, so, okay, go ahead.
Okay, now, we know he's talking to the Jews.
Uh-huh.
So when I see that word blessed,
Uh-huh.
and it means happy here, I can make a contrast that we know you're talking about the future, you're talking about the church coming.
Right.
And you're not happy in the old world. I mean, I don't know if I'm stretching, but bless are the peacemakers, you know, and he's leading up to the church.
Okay.
So when we see that blessing and happiness, you know, the happiness is going to be found in Christ. It's going to be found in the church. We know the old is going to be passed away. It's going to be done away with. You're not justified by the law, even though none of that's in here.
Mm-hmm.
But you can try to make the parallel and try to pull, you know, blessed. Why does he keep saying? The thing is, when you see all these scriptures, why he keeps saying blessed, 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 blessed.
Okay.
So I would try to, we know about being in Christ. Why is he emphasizing blessed so much?
Okay. All right. What are your thoughts? Anybody? Okay. Here's my thinking. Okay. I want you to look at the sermon. This is a slightly different way to look at it, but let me encourage you to look at it. First off, as we look at this, we've got to try to find out what is Jesus' main point in this whole sermon. Is it talking about who's happy and who's not? Well, I think it's leading to it, but I think the first few verses are the introduction. I think the introduction is found from chapter 5, verse 3 through chapter 5, verse 16. I think that's the introduction to his sermon. In verses 17 through 20, and specifically verse 20, that is the thesis or the theme of the entire sermon. All right, so let's look at this. He said, do not think that I come to destroy the law of the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Verse 20. Here to me is the theme. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. I think everything builds around that statement. Why? Well, okay. So you think about, we know what we know about the scribes and Pharisees. They were making laws that were heavier burdens for people to bear. Matthew chapter 23, he gets down to that last sermon he preaches publicly, and he's letting them have it. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Woe unto you, 7 different times in that passage. Woe unto you, scribes. So he's just laying it on them that time. But that's his last public sermon before he dies on the cross. Mm-hmm. It's like his last gasp, his last hope, by hitting them square in the face with what they are doing. He's trying that last point to try to touch their hearts. And they're the ones that wind up crucifying. Isn't it interesting? He starts this whole book off in Matthew chapter 5 talking about that scribes and Pharisees. And he ends it in Matthew 23, the last public speaking that we have, condemning them for their lifestyle. So then, now, if that's the main point of the sermon, think about how everything else fills back to it. The scribes and Pharisees said, and again, the Jews' thought were, and we hear it today, the Jews' thoughts are what? Well, if you are blessed by God, you're going to be rich. Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit. The Pharisees would say, if you're going to be rich, then you're always going to be happy. Jesus says, blessed are those who mourn. Mm-hmm. So think about how the Pharisees taught, and we hear a lot of those same teachings today. Creflo Dollar and some of these other guys, y'all need to buy me a $64 million aircraft. You know what I'm saying? And that's what brings happiness. And God wants you to get what you can get here, right now. And people give it to these guys, but that's not it. Poor in spirit, mourn, the meek, those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, those who are merciful. All of that goes back to everything they're not. So then, as he starts talking about it a little bit more, think about how right after that, Matthew 5:21. You've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder. Now remember, he had already said in verse 17 and 18, I didn't come to destroy the law, I came to fulfill it. And if I fulfilled it, then what? If I have fulfilled the law, then the law's done away with. Mm-hmm. It's like whenever I pay my wife just this last week, paid our car off a year early. All we're waiting on now is the title on that car.
You fulfilled the obligation early.
That's right. We fulfilled it. Now the contract is fulfilled. It's done. Now all we need is that piece of paper saying it's ours. Okay? So in that same respect, that's what Jesus did when he fulfilled the old covenant, right? He fulfilled it. The covenant was fulfilled. Therefore, it can be done away with. And that's what set up the new covenant. So he starts off talking. That's the reason why he starts off emphasizing that. Listen, you've heard that was said to those of old, you shall not murder. Well, that's one of the big 10, right? You know what I'm trying to say? That's one of the 10. Then he says, look, I say to you, whoever's angry with his brother without a cause is in danger of the judgment. Jesus deals with what? The heart. You see, he's not dealing with it like the Pharisees would, that would spend hours talking about, well, what exactly is murder? And exactly when do you do it? And all this other stuff. He's talking about the very thing that motivates it. Same thing with adultery. Same thing with, and he mentions the ideal of, again, the ideal of the marriage is sacred and binding. The ideal of covenant, again. The fact that we ought to live our lives in such a way to where we don't have to swear. That whenever he said, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but you don't even resist someone that's evil. Well, now that was really blowing the Jews' mind. It still blows ours, don't it? Think about it. Love. You shall love your neighbor. Now notice there in verse 43. You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Where did they get the idea of hating their enemy? That was their philosophy. Yes, the Old Testament, Leviticus 19, says you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But he didn't say what to do, so they added this part, hate your enemy. But I say unto you, notice how every one of those things, I say. And then he says, whenever you're doing good deeds, don't do it to be seen of men. Isn't that what the Pharisees did? All the time? All the time? Whenever you pray, don't be like the hypocrites who pray in the street corners. Isn't that what the Pharisees did? Right? But he says, you get in that closet and you're talking to your Father and you forgive. And again, hear that idea of forgive men their trespasses. Where does forgiveness begin? It begins in our hearts. Whenever you fast, notice he says when you fast, not if you fast. Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. The lamp of the body is the eye. If your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. And the bottom line, you can't serve two masters. That's what the Pharisees were trying to do. They were trying to serve God and mammon. So he says, don't worry about anything. Your Father's going to take care of you. You reckon some of the Pharisees worried about where they're going to get their next meal? Probably. Do we? Yeah. Maybe not that bad. We're not living day to day like most of them were. We're living week to week, maybe. Right? Seriously, that's but the bottom line is it. And then he says, why are you worrying about anything? So he says, the ideal of judgment. The Pharisees were judging everybody about everything. He said, unless your righteousness is better than that. So he says, judge not that you be not judged. Now, that is the only passage out of the Bible today that most people know. Everybody's telling us, judge not. You Christians need to judge not. Let's put it back in its context. The context says, look, you first remove the plank from your eye, then you will clearly be able to see to remove the speck from your brother's eye. We're supposed to be helping one another. That necessarily means that we judge. And he goes on and he says, listen, there's going to be people that are going to teach false doctrine. You need to know the difference. Not everyone who says, Lord, unto me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. The Pharisees were probably throwing their chest out. Look at us. Well, look at what we are. And Jesus is saying, I don't want any of that. And he gets to the bottom line of it. He said, verse 24 through 27, how do you end the sermon? Now, you see, here's the point is, the main point is what? Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. Everything he all said goes back to that main point. Somehow, some way or another. Now we come to, he said it in the introduction, this is what I'm looking for. It comes to the conclusion and says what? Whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him unto a wise man that builds his house on the rock. And I've often said at South Cobb, folks, that isn't just a song for little kids. That's a song for all of us. The wise man built his house upon the rock. That's, I wanted one Sunday to just get up and lead everybody in that song. Just to get across the point, this isn't just something for kids. This is what Jesus is saying to adults, and this is the way we need to live. And so how is he judging his disciples? By if they hear and do. It's not enough just to hear it and then go on and say, I can't do nothing about it. It's doing it. Think about, and I challenge you, and this might be something he gets you, encourages you to do, but if I was doing that, I would encourage you to go through every sermon in the Bible, but specifically in the New Testament, and see what the main points are. Look at Paul preaching to the Athenians in Acts chapter 17. Listen to Paul in Acts chapter 13 whenever he's preaching to those in that first missionary journey. Look at the points. Look at the sermon on Acts chapter 2. What was Peter's main point? What was his main point in that sermon?
Acts chapter 2.
Yeah.
Repentance.
Right. But his main point was what? Nobody's going to repent unless they see a reason. So what's the reason? You killed Christ. You killed Christ. Now let me tell you, I know he's Christ. And he gives 3 points as to how we know it. Number one, the scriptures foretold about it. Number two, we saw it. And number 3, the miracles that he did that you guys saw. He's the Christ. And whenever he preached that way, then in verse 37, they all looked at them and said, men and brethren, what shall we do? But you see, everything was pointing up to what? Jesus is the Messiah, and you guys killed him. What are we going to do about it? Repent and be baptized. There's the conclusion. And notice another part of the sermon is with many other words. We don't know what the other words were. That's what we have. So if you outline that sermon, you're beginning to see the main, in every sermon there needs to be a main point. And then everything else goes back to that point somehow, some way or another.
Mm-hmm. So in reading, what would be a tool to help you identify the main point? If you're not skilled in looking for, you're just reading.
Mm-hmm.
And so how would I know what the main point is? What am I looking for?
Right. That's where hermeneutics come in. Homiletics is to be able to preach it. Hermeneutics is learning it to study it. And that's where, and a lot of that comes over years of study. Because again, I've preached on the Sermon on the Mount, I'm telling how many times. But it isn't until just recently that I've read it and reread it and reread it, and then it dawned on me, this is his main point. This is what Jesus is trying to build. Everything goes toward it, everything points toward it, and everything comes back to it in some way or another. And that's the point for us. Don't be like them. So you think about that, and it takes a while to study that. So if you're preaching through, I'm preaching through the book of Mark now. And we're just doing it every Sunday, passage by passage, all the way through the book of Mark. So that gives you a lot of, number one, that solves a lot of problems because I've never preached through the book of Mark. So they can't say, I've heard that before. And then you've got this idea as well. Think about it this way. I know exactly what I'm going to be preaching on the next few weeks. I know, so I've got to deal with the text. Then I just take from the text. I go into the passage and take, so whenever I preach again beginning in September, I'm going to be talking about the triumphal entry. Well, why did Jesus do that way? All up to that point in time in Mark, he had kept telling his disciples and everybody else, don't tell anybody I'm the Christ. Don't you tell anybody I'm the Christ. Now, literally, within 1 week when he dies, he rides into Jerusalem on that donkey. And it's like everything's down now. I'm riding into this city right now as your Messiah.
Well, basically, he's riding to his death.
Right. He is riding to his death.
Mm-hmm.
Now, but whenever he rode in there on a donkey, which suggested the idea of a kingdom of peace, he was saying, in essence, I'm the guy you've been looking for. But guess what? I'm not riding a white horse conquering everybody. I'm riding a donkey, which suggests the idea of peace. That's what my kingdom's all about. It's all about peace. Think about Isaiah 9. He is the Prince of Peace. So that was his way of saying, I am who you say I am. But your whole ideal of the kingdom is skewed. You think we're going to come in here and conquer everybody. That's not what it's about. We are conquering, but it's through love, and it's through peace, and it's through joy, and it's through me dying on the cross. And so you see that, I don't know how many of us today, but let's be honest about this. Think about our culture and our world. We have for a long time in our society and in the church, we have bought into the idea that if we elect the right people into office, they will get our agenda done. God is not using kingdoms that way. He doesn't expect his law to be voted on. He said it, that settles it, whether we want to believe it or not. So the bottom line is, as we look at this, it's not about getting the right people in office. It's about what? Getting Jesus into their hearts. Teaching God's law, God's will, God's way. The church, we've been co-opted. We have some preachers preaching sermons, and listen, years ago I bought into that, and it's wrong. I tell you, it's wrong. telling people who to vote for and all that other stuff. And no. God does use the kingdom of men to do whatever he wants to get done. But me voting for a guy in office doesn't mean that means I'm voting for that guy to do that. You know? Think about that for a few minutes. And so we are, it's 7:30. Okay. We do need to take about a 5-minute break. But I just challenge you to think about that idea and what we're asking people to do. We need to begin people to follow the spiritual kingdom. The kingdom's going to last forever. The kingdom's coming and go. America's been here 200, going on 300 years. That's good, but Rome was gone in 400. Most kingdoms didn't even last that long. So let's take about a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and I'll go back through this a little bit more, okay?
Okay.
All right? So,
So do y'all do Plexus?
my wife does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do we.
She's a big believer in it. That's the reason why she never played it.
There you go.
There you go. So I'm not going to play that.
Yep.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, we should wake it up by itself now.
All right.
Right, what you hearing? We'll get that syllabus.
Yep. Whenever my reason for second class is my weakness is investing in Oklahoma. These ones over, so that job will be. And so he's thinking of stepping down the next few years.
So I think about that Oklahoma.
Okay. We're back. Glad to see you. A sample sermon outline. Again, it always begins, as I said earlier, with an introduction, right? What are you trying to do in the introduction? Introduce. Introduce. There you go. It's the idea you want to gain somebody's attention. So when Jesus started the Sermon on the Mount, blessed, happy are those who are poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. That was totally against everything that they had been taught all their lives. That caught everybody. Why is he saying this? If he's talking and if he's about the kingdom, why is he saying this is part of it? So you're gaining people's attention. How do you do it? By the use of a story with a word or two of suspense, sometimes with a sentence. I, this year, have been having the opportunity to speak at some series, and I was talking about, two churches asked me to preach on forgiveness back to back. They didn't mean to, but one church asked me to do it, and then another church, and I studied on forgiveness, and it's one of those things that you think you know what it's talking about until you really start studying it, and then all of a sudden, wow, I didn't realize there was so much there. C.S. Lewis says that everybody thinks that forgiveness is a lovely thing until you have to forgive somebody. And I started off with that statement. And everybody kind of like, he's right. It is, you know. And by, you know, you use an illustration maybe. Okay? In essence, what you're doing is you're trying to establish your right to speak. You're trying to establish that you have the right to say something like that. You might say something like this. Here's a biblical teaching you may have trouble dealing with. And all of a sudden, say, you know how we always are. Well, I don't have that problem. That applies to sister so-and-so. That applies to brother so-and-so. And that person right there, boy, they really need that sermon. Everybody but me. The story is told one time about a preacher who got up and preached, and every sermon, this guy would come back and say, boy, you gave it to him this morning, brother. And that one Sunday, there was snow on the ground. And there were two people that showed up, was the preacher and that brother. He used this as the perfect opportunity to talk to that brother about every sin that he knew that brother was committing. After it was all over, they got down and they walked to the back. The guy shook his hand and says, Well, you would give it to them this morning, preacher, if they were here, you know. So the bottom line, you think about it, we try to prepare the audience. We're trying to get their attention. We've got to say something quickly to where people will start listening to us. It might start off with a joke. It might start off with something that, again, if it's a serious matter, it's something to get them thinking. And a lot of times you might talk about, like I said, this is something you have a problem with. Maybe we need to deal with it in that respect. And you're trying to prepare the audience in the introduction to what's going to happen in the discussion. You might have to give some definitions, give some background information, or other preliminary. You know, that's what you're doing in the introduction. So as I said earlier, whenever you understand what the passage is you're going to be talking about, you do your study about that, then you work out your points, then you do the introduction and the conclusion from what you've already worked out. Always do the body of the sermon first. Do the body of the sermon first. That way, there have been years whenever I would always do the introduction first, and I thought, well, that's not a good way to do it. And then I found that as I was doing this over a period of time, that sometimes my introduction didn't have anything to do with the sermon. No, this is what you're trying to do. So do the study. Find out what you're going to talk about. So look in the text for what that particular passage is really saying. See how it fits in with a greater context of the book. And then you come up with the introduction and the conclusion. Then you, like I said, you need to have a thesis statement, the summary sentence. There ought to be a sentence. In other words, you ought to be able to sum up your entire sermon in one sentence. A thesis statement is what it's called. So, what are you trying to do in this sermon? Well, you know, if a sermon on instrumental music, that's an easy thesis statement, isn't it? I'm going to try to show how instrumental music is wrong and how we should not do it. But there ought to be something more to it than just that, right? Because all of us, like I said earlier, we'll agree with it's wrong, but what should be my application if I think that that's not what needs to happen? You know, how should that apply to me? We're already not using it, so okay, well, how does that apply to me? So it should be a simple declarative sentence. You're trying to sum up the entire sermon in one sentence. That way they can know what you're talking about, and it also obligates you, when you've got this thesis statement here, that one sentence, then you have to try to stay on path the whole time. True or false? There have been a lot of people that have preached sermons that have chased rabbits. You know what I'm talking about? They go all over the field, and then they come back. And sometimes those rabbits needed to be chased, but at the same time, sometimes they chase the rabbits so much that you miss the whole point of the sermon. You begin to think the rabbit's the whole point of the sermon. And that's not what needs to happen. Okay? And this brother says here, and again, it's something to think about, don't make a double-headed sermon statement. In other words, you're only going to get across one major point. What is the main thing you want them to walk out with after that sermon? What's the main thing? The main point. What's the main point? Hopefully, whenever again, if God gives me the opportunity to preach again, and I preach about the triumphal entry, I'm going to talk about the idea, and my main point is going to be, how do you see the kingdom? Is it a spiritual kingdom, or is it someplace here on this earth? Mm-hmm. Well, it is here on this earth in the body of the people, but really the kingdom is a spiritual kingdom, and we're thinking about eternity. And if we understand Jesus and what he came to do, then, as I said, we're not going to put faith in people. We're going to put faith in him to work out his way in this kingdom. Okay? So, then you have the body of the sermon, the discussion, the body. You're going to present the bulk of the sermon here. It'll generally consist of 2 or 3 main points. All right? Each point should develop this thesis. In other words, these points should come back to this thesis statement. So you sit down and write down, what is the thesis? What is the main point of my sermon? And everything else should always point or prove this statement in one way or another. That's what it boils down to. All right?
Now, in delivering the message, as you follow your outline, the thesis statement comes before your intro.
Yeah. Because why? Again, you've done your study. You've looked up the commentaries. You've done your work. You've wrestled with the passage yourself. You come up with what is his main point in the passage. Then everything else comes pointing to this. Okay? So then, as I said, once you've got this done, and you've got this thesis statement, and you've got the body all worked out, then it's easy to come up with the introduction and the conclusion. It's easy to come up with that. All right? Each point should develop the thesis, moving toward the conclusion, and each point needs to have a good transition statement. Now, what is a transition?
That helps you move from one point to the next.
That's right. And so you need to come up with a good statement that moves from one point to the next.
And it also informs the audience that you are moving to
the
point.
That's right. And sometimes, listen to what, sometimes we get kind of lazy about it as preachers. Here's the first point. Here's the second point. Here's the third point, Well, come up with a better transition statement than that. Thinking about what Jesus said here, now notice what else he had to say. Thinking about what Paul said here, notice how this fits with what we've just said. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to come up with this transition point. And each point should be supported by a logical subpoint. So then you have finally the conclusion. And what are you doing in the conclusion? You tell them what you're going to say, you say it, then what? You tell them what you said. Okay? And again, you're recapitulating the basic thesis and the main points made. You're making the appropriate applications. Don't ever, and again, sometimes we do this. We don't mean to, but we don't ever walk or try to preach a lesson or teach a lesson. And this should be true in Bible classes or anything else. Always have an application. Always have an application. The more I've read on preaching and studying, they always emphasize the idea that every sermon ought to have an application. If there's not, then why preach it? Think again about the Jesus Sermon on the Mount. Well, as he concludes this sermon, he has pointed out what? I expect you to be different than the scribes and Pharisees, right? So then he concludes, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them. What's his main application? Folks, it's not enough to hear it. You've got to do it. So everything he's just said. Now, again, think about the number of sermons that have been preached on the Sermon on the Mount since that time. And every one of them have their points, and you can make it that way. So, and again, here's where you try to make the call to action. You extend the invitation. And again, so we always wind up with saying what? Come as together we stand and sing, right? I dream of the day when I can come up with something else. There have been a couple of times when I finished a sermon, if you need to, please come. I didn't tell them to stand up. The song was like, okay. And sometimes that kind of throws, but okay, all right. We get in a rut in church, don't we? Let's be honest. We really do. And what happens is we get in a certain rut, and then if anybody changes something, then we literally think that we haven't worshiped that morning. Because we're thinking about the change that just disturbed us so much. Right? And it ought not to be that way. I'm not for change just for the sake of change, but sometimes just to get us out of our 3 songs of prayer, another song lethargy, we need to change that. Okay? Now, as you're preaching this sermon, here's some points you need to do. Number 1, be very specific. Be specific. Jesus was specific in the Sermon on the Mount about what he wanted them to do. Not just to hear it, but to do it. Right? So everything he said all pointed out to that point. So be very specific. So when you're making that application, all right, you're sitting there, you're preaching a sermon on marriage, divorce, and remarriage, and you've got people there that have been married and divorced. Okay, so they're already hitting some things there. But you got people there that they're sitting back, the widows are sitting there thinking, this has no application to me. Well, now wait a minute. Whoa. Isn't it interesting that Titus will say in Titus chapter 2 that the older women will teach the younger women to love their husbands, to love their children? You older members that have already lost your mate, you need to be teaching this to the youngers. Those of you that are in a marriage relationship right now, you know as well as I do that you're going to have problems. It's going to happen because there's two people living in the same house. You're going to have problems. Don't ever say the divorce word. Don't ever say that word. Let it be a curse word in your family. You husbands, you be what you're supposed to be. Christ loved the church. Well, how much? Well, okay, he loved the church enough to give his life for it. And every husband says, yeah, I'll do that. I'll give my life for my wife. Okay, good, great. Why don't you vacuum for her one day? Why don't you wash the dishes for her one day? Oh, now, Tommy, you don't know. I'd die for her, but washing, that's her job. No. You see what I'm being specific. Here's specific ways to do this. We can talk about it, and everybody says, yeah, okay, but now I'm getting down to the point where folks say, oh, well, maybe that's what I need to be doing. Describe what you want them to do rather than just evaluate. Describe it, okay? So, as I said a moment ago, you give your life for your wife, okay, vacuum. If she's sitting there tired because she's dealt with kids all day, you vacuum. I never will forget, years ago, I was speaking to a group of ninth graders, and this was many years ago. I was in a freshman high school science class, and the teacher asked me to teach these young people about what love was all about and all. And I did it. And I said, let me tell you what love really is. And they looked at me and they said, what is it? Let me tell you what love is. And I said, I know you hear all the time it's about sex. I know you hear that it's some funny, fuzzy feeling, but I'll tell you what love is. I said, love is your mama with a wet rag washing your face when you've just thrown up all over the place. And love is your mama cleaning everything for the 15th time because you've thrown up in the bed too. Gross! Yuck! Bottom line was, I hope they got the point. That's what love is all about. That's what it's all about. Mm-hmm. Love is a husband holding the hand of your wife who's pregnant with your child when she's, sick at that point in time. That's what love's all about. So you see, we're describing it now. Now I'm describing it. We're being specific about it. Explain your usage of words, okay? Sometimes you can say, when I say this, it's like, here's what I'm really trying to say, folks. When I say this, here's what I'm really trying to say. Explain your usage of words. Okay? So you're being specific, you're describing, you're explaining your uses of words, and illustrate. Jesus' greatest sermons were taught in what? Parables, stories. And there's a whole genre of preaching out there. As I said earlier, you'll learn this later, but there's topical sermons where you take a topic and you're studying everything the Bible has to say about it, like baptism or the Lord's Supper, something like that. You've got exegetical sermons where you have everything all in the text that you're studying. You have textual sermons where, again, the main points is in the text you're studying. And then you have sometimes narrative sermons. Narrative sermons are a little bit harder to preach, but a lot of people are saying today, that's the way you ought to go. You ought to tell stories. The problem is sometimes some people don't always get the gist of the story. When Jesus in Matthew chapter 13 gave the parable of the soils, what did the disciples have to do? When they got him in private, they said, Lord, tell us what you meant with that. Right? So you see, it's kind of like, well, if I have to explain it, then maybe I'm not doing a good job, but that's the point. We've got to be able to do it. So again, when we're talking about illustrations, for example, David cut off the head of Goliath. Now, if this was made into a real-life movie today, there would be arteries spurting blood, You know what I'm trying to say? There would be arteries spurting blood and all the gore. We don't have to get that gory. But the Bible, the ideal is, you know, all you got to say is he cut off his head with a sword. You don't have to get that gory about it, but some people today want it to be that way. Don't use more illustrations than the Bible does. And he says 1 illustration per point is normally enough. 1 illustration per point is normally enough. Use good illustrations not only clarify, but they help to hold the audience's attention. People will listen to a story. So a lot of times they encourage us to tell a story at the beginning, or maybe tell a story at the end. Okay? So when I was preaching that sermon on forgiveness, I started off that sermon with a statement by C.S. Lewis. Forgiveness is a wonderful thing until you've got to forgive somebody. And then I told the story of Simon Wiesenthal. Now, I don't know if you remember this guy. Simon Wiesenthal died in 2005, but he spent his entire life hunting down Nazis from the concentration. And the reason is because him and his wife, Clyde, lost 89 relatives in the Holocaust. 89 of his family members died in the Holocaust. And I found this story, and what happened is Wiesenthal was about to go out on work detail at the concentration camp he was with. And all of a sudden, one of the soldiers jerked him up. And of course, at that moment in time, you're sitting there thinking, you're a Jew. This is it. They're going to kill me right here now. And they jerked him out of the line and shoved him into this room. And there was lying there a soldier. White. I mean, he was robed in white because he had wounds all over his face. Couldn't even hardly see his face. And the soldier's name was Carl. And Carl started telling Wiesenthal his life story. He said, I was born in a Nazi family. I was part of the SS. He said, I was on the Russian front, and I saw all the horrors that you could possibly imagine fighting the battles with the Russians. And he says, and this went on for about 2 hours. He said, there's something that haunts me, and I never will forget it. And I asked that a Jew be brought in, if there was any Jews left. He said, in one place in Russia, we herded all the Jews into a wooden barn, and then we set the barn on fire. He said, I heard the screams, and he said, the screams haunt me to this day. He said, I know that what I've done was wrong. And he said, I asked that if there were any Jews left, he said, I asked that one Jew be brought in so I could tell you the story and ask your forgiveness. He said, I want to die in peace. Wiesenthal in his book was talking about the fact how he tried to get up 2 or 3 times to walk out because he was just, Finally, Carl said, I have to hear from a Jew that you will forgive me. Now, we can get into the discussion as to whether or not Wiesenthal had the right to forgive him or not, but what he did at the very last is he got up and walked out without saying a word. And this bugged Wiesenthal. And afterwards, he asked 32 different theologians, Jewish rabbis, Christian theologians. He said, what would you have done? 6 of them said that he done wrong, that he should have offered some sort of solace. The others said, no, you did what was right. You walked out. That's what you needed to do. And the point that I made when I told that story at the beginning, I think about in the church how we get offended over the littlest things. It's not like somebody's asking us to forgive us because we just murdered half their family. But I then went from that story, and at the very end of the sermon, I said, you remember that story that I told you to begin with? Wiesenthal, after we talked about forgiveness and what God said, Jesus said about it. I said, now what will you do? Now you see what have I done? I've used the story, I used it I even used it as a conclusion and brought home the point. This is what we need to be doing, as opposed to just preaching a sermon about what forgiveness is and talking about all the words and talking about what all it means. If we got that story in the back of our mind the whole time, and then we start thinking about our brothers and sisters that I ain't getting along with too well, then all of a sudden things are put in perspective.
It becomes more real.
It becomes really more real.
Mm-hmm.
So think about that. They clarify. They keep holding the audience's attention. Use comparisons. Jesus used comparison. The kingdom of heaven is like unto a man. Went out and sowed seed in his field. Use comparisons. Metaphors. Okay, similes, things along that line. That's where figures of speech come up. Develop the use of and the love for plain language. Speak plainly. Speak plainly. We don't need to make it so hard that people can't understand it. If you're trying to, again, draw people's attention, appeal to the sense of sight. So sometimes, if you're preaching on Psalms 1 verse 1, what does it say? I remember off the top of your head. Psalms 1 verse 1. Let's look at it, okay? I went blank too, okay? I was sitting here thinking, what is it saying? Man, I got to do this. I got to show myself. Okay. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, or stands in the paths of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. Now, do you hear this? And again, you've heard this. Walk, stand, sit. There's 3 points right there, right? They're not walking with the ungodly. They're not standing in the paths of sinners. They're not sitting, getting comfortable with the sinners.
But,
That's a word picture, right?
one of your words have a different letter.
Well, you don't. There again. You so want to see what I said there. That's where. But that would be a sermon right there. Walks not, stands not, sits not with the wicked. All right. Then at the very end of it, he says what? He said, "He shall be like a tree." Verse 3, planted by the rivers of water. Now you think about that, and you could draw a word picture here. I grew up on a farm in Alabama. We had a creek, and there were some trees there, that huge, massive oak trees by this creek. And there were times whenever the creek would raise up, and you could see the flood marks on these trees, but they still stood firm. Because they're able to get that extra water, they're stronger and things along that line. He said, here's what you need to be doing. You need to stand like a tree planted by the rivers of water. You need to be bearing your fruit. You need to be not withering, and whatever this man shall do shall prosper. Then he contrasts it with the ungodly, right? So you see, you could preach 2 or 3 sermons just on those 3 verses. What does the godly man do? He doesn't stand with sinners, but in point 2, and again, don't follow the P's and all this other stuff. His delights in the law of the Lord. He meditates. You can spend a sermon talking about meditation. How many times the Bible talk about meditating? A bunch. Look it up when you go home. In King James Version, New King James Version. Look it up in the English Standard Version, where he emphasizes the idea of pondering or meditating. And then, you see, that's a sermon that's preached over and over again, using the sense of sight. So that's what we're talking about there. All right? Next, restate important ideas in different words. Restate important ideas in different words. Say it one way, say it again some way else. People think differently. People have been reared differently. People come up with different ideas. I'm sometimes amazed at what people can come up with. I'm sometimes amazed at, and I say this with respect, please don't misunderstand, but I'm sometimes amazed at how seemingly, forgive me, stupid people are. And there have been times when I've looked in the mirror and said, boy, that was pretty stupid on my part, But think about that. So now sometimes they may not get it one way, say it another way. One time I was studying with a lady in a Bible study, and I was trying to explain to her a passage of scripture, and I could tell by the look on her face, she just wasn't getting it. My wife was with me in the study, and she just said one simple statement, and the light went on. And it's like, boy, I'm glad you're here. I was making it harder than I really needed to. She said it in such a way where she got it just that quick. See, and that's part of it. That's part of it. So sometimes, again, you could preach a sermon and everybody might have heard it from you before. Somebody else could preach the very same sermon that you preached, but because they say it in different terms, they get it quicker than they would for you. That's just the way people are. And again, we've got to be able to become, as it was, Paul would say, I become all things to all men that I might by all means save some. Don't try to set a record for ground covered. In other words, don't try to cover all the ground. Now, you see, here's something that I've done, and it helps me. Last year, I preached through the entire book of Romans on Sunday morning. Every sermon was dealing with something in Romans. This year, and I've never done this before, I've taught classes on Romans and so forth, but this year I've taught simply on the book of Mark. Now, you think about the gospel we teach. We will spend a lot of time teaching John, right? You've got a class here, the Gospel of John. And then you've got the Synoptic Gospels, because I studied Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but then you got John, okay? Mm-hmm. You know, so, but I'm studying through Mark. Sometimes I can get so bogged down that you can get to the point where it's kind of like, really, you know, but that's why you've got to keep the pace going. And it also helps whenever you have breaks like gospel meetings and stuff like that, where they're hearing something different, seeing something else. But don't try to set a record for ground covered. I sometimes have done that, and it's because I'm trying to get everything done, finished by the end of the year. Well, I'm only in Mark chapter 11. I've got 5 more chapters in 4 more months. No, you can do that. Really? It depends. It depends. A lot of stuff in there. Be sure it's clear in your mind before you preach it. Make sure it's clear in your mind before you preach it. I spent a lot of time studying Romans in detail because whenever I was standing up there preaching it, I wanted to know. Now, Romans in some passages are easy, but you get Romans 9, 10, 11 where you have the whole idea of predestination coming in there. Well, you've got to know what you're talking about. You've got to know what you're talking about, especially with the way the world looks at predestination and what the Bible says about predestination. You've got to know in your mind before what's going on. Okay? So, and again, you close with a summary of your thesis and point. Now, let's talk about language for a moment. Some preachers like to show everybody how smart they are. And they will tell you the Greek word and what it means. Okay? Nothing wrong with that. Please don't misunderstand me. There's nothing wrong with that. Problem is with that, though, is most folks don't really care what the Greek word says. They're not going to get into it that deep. What does it mean to my life? Years ago, one preacher, not a member of the church, but he says, it's not good enough for you to be able to explain the 10 toes of the beast in Revelation. That doesn't mean anything to the little widow lady that's sewing and knitting things to be able to live every day. She can care less what the 10 toes of the beast are all about. Mm-hmm. And I've always tried to keep that in my mind. I can go into, I've studied a lot and I can go into some deep theological terms, but what good is it going to do? Matthew 16:16. Peter said unto him, no, Matthew 16:16. Oh, Matthew. Matthew. I heard that. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, sometimes some people want us to hear their knowledge and they could say, thou art the pre-existing messianic parousia, the eschatological realization of antiquarian prophetic inspiration. That's saying the same thing. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. But you see, that's what some people try to come across with, okay? Avoid foreignisms. Be sure their use is justified before you use them. All right? Here's another one. When you're talking about preaching, grog. Get rid of gobbledygook. Grog. Get rid of gobbledygook. Pompous, arrogant sounding, pointless wordliness. Okay? Get rid of Gobbledygook. Don't add those extra words to try to show everybody how smart you are. You don't need to do that. Use appropriate language. Okay.
So that means you can't get your hack on.
Huh?
That means you can't get your hack on.
It's something like, get rid of it. I don't know what you're saying there, but yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
In the black church, it's like,
You know? Yeah. Get rid of the gobbledygook. Yeah, I've heard that. I know what you're talking about now. Yeah. Get rid of it. But listen, we do it in the white church too, don't we?
Yeah.
We do. Sometimes we really do. We've all got our ways. Use correct grammar as much as possible. Sometimes.
Y'all hear me?
Yeah. Sometimes we don't mean to, but we use incorrect grammar and it throws some people off. So we've got to be careful. And use appropriate language.
Not slang.
Not slang. You don't need to be, you think about the language used a lot of times with sexual meaning. You don't need to be using that kind of stuff. But do we need to be preaching about sexual sin? Absolutely. You know, I remember that one Sunday I was preaching through Galatians and come to the passage where, you know, we talked about sin, adultery, fornication, you know, all that stuff. And I kind of, you know, was trying to bring the point out. And some folks got up and walked out. And I asked them later, I said, well, I didn't want our children to hear that. I said, well, how could you tell me how I could have preached on it without it? You know, he said, I'm not fussing at you. I said, I know you needed to preach on it. It's just my children didn't need to hear it. But then at the same time, I was sitting there thinking to myself, if they're going to public school, they probably already have and use them, you know.
Be surprised what they know.
Yes, exactly right.
But in a situation like that, and you prepared your sermon, you prepared to deliver it, you don't know what the children are going to be there or not.
That's right. So you got to work with that. You got to work with that.
But you know, the way you presented it, I mean, I don't see where it should have offended them. You know.
Yeah. And
those are Bible terminologies.
Right. But there again, you know, it was, and it's something that I've always remembered since that time. You know, I thought about it. It's okay.
Now, if you might use the word fornication, but the child knows sex. So you got two words. You don't know fornication, but you say sex, but you didn't say sex. So, you know, it may not have been the children, it may have been the parent.
It may have been. I'm just saying, this is what you run into, okay? Do we need to hear it? Yes. Does the world need to hear what the Bible says? Yes, absolutely. So, wasn't too long ago, I preached again in Mark chapter 9, where we talked about divorce. And, you know, if they were watching and if they were there, they came that Sunday and they looked at me, and one of them come up to me, he said, I was waiting to see how you was going to handle that. I said, well, what do you think? He said, man, do you know how much divorce is in the church? I said, yeah. Well, weren't you afraid of offending somebody? Well, I can't change what Jesus said about it. I have the responsibility to tell what the Bible says about it, period. Well, that takes a lot of guts. Folks need to hear it, okay? That's it. But you see, I wasn't trying to be ugly about it. I wasn't trying to, you know, I said it's a sin. I talked about Malachi 2:16. God hates divorce. It's a sin. Here's the reason why. I preached on it a couple of years ago. And there's a website out there. You can look it up on the internet. I can't remember what the website is. But it actually, somebody did a paper for a college thesis, master thesis or doctorate. I'm not sure. But they studied something like 20 or 30 states and the actual cost of divorce. And it's in the billions of dollars. Billions of dollars. When you start adding not just the divorce itself, but the welfare and everything else, when you've got children involved, it's absolutely phenomenal how much money is spent in the United States on divorce.
Oh, yeah.
So, all right. How do you get people's attention? Say some things. Sometimes here's some other ideas. Ask rhetorical questions. What is a rhetorical question? It's a question that has an answer already in it, the way you ask it, okay? Sometimes you get people's attention by this.
Oh, say anything.
Ask a question in an adult Bible class. And what we will do 90% of the time is go ahead and answer our own question because we can't stand silence. Right?
Yes.
You ask a question, and then, as you're asking the question, you try to count to 10. It bugs us. It bugs us. It really does, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And see, I didn't even make it 10. Well, I was counting. It wasn't 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It was just, I didn't even make 10 bugs us. Sometimes you can whisper. Whispering. Now, I always believe that if you're going to preach, you need to preach loud enough for people to hear. But sometimes if people have to listen a little bit, if they have to go, what do you say? And that's going to get their attention. You see, things like that. Fresh figures of speech. People want to know something new about something old. So the widow of Luke 21 cast her mites into clay jars by the steps of the temple. Describe it. Talk about it. Talk about what it meant. Speak on subjects that concern your audience. How to stop worrying. How to pray better. Right? Still tell stories of people that struggle. Tell stories about people. Personal interest stories. All right? Be concrete. Be concrete. When you're getting up, be concrete. John Doe is stubborn and intractable. Now everybody's going to think, what does the word intractable mean? But at least at the same time, you're what? They're going to have to think about that a little bit. Use picture-building words. And you need to be interested in your subject, right? If you're not interested in your subject, are you going to get anybody else to be interested in your subject? No. I've heard some speeches. How many of you have ever watched TED Talks?
I've heard of it.
Watch them. Most of them are, if you're giving they actually have parameters. You're given a certain amount of time. You cannot go over it, period. You cannot go under it. So these people practice that thing over and over again. So if you're going to say something in 10 minutes, now let me say this. It is harder to do a 10-minute lesson than it is a 30-minute lesson.
Well, you've got to compact it.
You've got to compact it, and every word has to mean something. The person that preached at Gettysburg before Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address preached for 2.5 hours. Lincoln got up and said the Gettysburg Address in 3 minutes. Which one do we remember?
Gettysburg Address.
That's right. And the preacher that preached for 2.5 hours came to Lincoln afterwards and said, you said in 3 minutes what I tried to say in 2.5 hours. So the bottom line is you have, again, read everything that everybody was talking about that Gettysburg Address, and we find out that it sticks with us because it was so short, but he said so much in that 3 minutes. So, vitality. You develop and demonstrate it with your body. So when you're standing up there preaching, some people hold on for dear life. I'm afraid if I don't, okay, I walk. All right, I do. I have this nervous thing about me, so I walk. All right. Bottom line is you've got to be enthusiastic. You've got to be, make the points that need to be made. Raise your voice, lower your voice. Get up like this and look at them. Back up a little bit. Every one of those gestures means something. And again, the more you do it, the easier it becomes. All right? Again, it's magnetism. You show that you're excited, you show that you're interested, and you're being enthusiastic. True or false?
True.
People run to a fire. Right? Some people run to a fire. Think about this. I've talked with firemen in times past. They said, you know what? They say, what's always interesting to me is the rats and everything alive is running out of the house and we're running to them. Well, okay, you know, that's it. So bottom line is, you know, be earnest. We need to be fired up about divorce. We need to be fired up about sexual sin. We need to be fired up enough to emphasize to people God's fired up about it. And it's going to cause people to lose their soul. So all of these things come in there. All right?
And those things that you just mentioned are things that people don't want to hear, or some ministers don't want to preach.
That's right. Because they want to try to keep the peace. And Jesus came to bring peace, but he went through kicking over some tables too. And sometimes that has to happen. And again, especially when we're preachers, when we're relying on brethren to feed our families. Okay? The temptation is really strong not to deal with those difficult issues. But they need to hear it because we're dealing with eternal matters. Souls may be lost because we haven't dealt with it. So, I mean, we've got to sit down as preachers and ask ourselves, you know, are we willing to pay the price to do that? That's the bottom line.
Yeah, one time I was teaching a Bible study, and the subject of choosing a mate came up.
Mm-hmm.
And I started talking about, you know, we got to start out, we light the earth. What does darkness have with light? And I said, me as if I was a single Christian man, where should I be looking for my mate? Mm-hmm. Should it be in the world or should it be in the church? Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying that you can't marry a non-believer, but I'm saying principle. A man and a woman, they're looking for, if a woman looking for her head, mm-hmm. if I'm looking for a helpmeet, where should I be looking? Right. Well, I get all these answers, you know, comments about, well, I married so-and-so, and he wasn't in the church, he wasn't. I said, I'm not talking about, God bless you, that it worked out. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying, realistically, if we're looking, where should we be looking?
That's right.
I'm not saying that you can't marry somebody who's not a believer, but if we're talking about principles, you're not married. And what kind of advice should someone be giving you? Mm-hmm. Go to the bar, look for your mate?
Yeah, that's right.
And man, talking about the feedback, mm-hmm. They was going to stone me.
Well, that's part of it, right? Right. So you cultivate enthusiasm, you cultivate sympathy, show people that you're really interested in them. Whenever I'm sitting there talking about divorce and I look out there and see people that right now are fighting at their home and I know about it, there's tears running down my cheeks. There's compassion. And sometimes I say, brethren, I say this because these problems are going on right now in some of your families. Divorce. I said, if I was to ask you how many people have been touched by divorce in your families, how many would raise your hand? And I said, don't do it. Because I dare say 90% of you, somewhere down the line. You've got to cultivate sympathy, and you've got to cultivate enthusiasm. Eloquence is thought on fire. Winston Churchill. Great, my opinion, okay, let me emphasize this. It's interesting to me that if you look at history and the whole gamut of history, that at very critical junctures where history takes place, there's always men that rise to the top. World War II. We don't remember too much about the presidents before then or anything like that, but World War II, we remember Franklin Roosevelt. We remember Winston Churchill. Mm-hmm. We remember Joseph Stalin. Now, Stalin, you know the kind of man that he was, and I'm not, but you think about Churchill. And the very first speech he made to Parliament after he became prime minister, he had been telling them all along, we can't appease the Nazis. When Neville Chamberlain came back, had an agreement with Hitler that he would not attack Britain. Remember that? He said, we've got the peace. And less than 2 years later, they were in the middle of the Battle of Britain. Mm-hmm. And the bottom line is they elected Churchill, and Churchill in that very first speech says, I'm not going to come here to give you any promises except we're going to be through blood, toil, sweat, and tears. But we will fight until there is nobody else here to fight. And you see, he strengthened their resolve. And then for the first time, some of them thought, okay, we're in this for the long haul. And you remember the British had been in the problem of World War I. It's all over again. It's all happening again. Now they needed somebody that was going to strengthen their resolve, and Churchill was the guy.
Well, here we go again.
Yeah.
Fighting Germany.
Here we go again, fighting Germany. And so, again, and Churchill said, if you have an important point to make, don't be subtle and clever. Use a pile driver. In other words, get across the point you've got to make. All right? All right. So that's what the class is going to be about. That's what we've talked about the first thing. Again, forgive me for all the lack of preparation, and forgive me again about the way the whole thing played out. Thank you for your understanding. I appreciate it so much. I'm trying to do better at this thing of directing. I've been trying to do it for the last 2 years. I see so many things I'm trying to change, and I keep thinking, okay, I'm getting better at it, and then something like this happens, so I'm going to keep on, you'll keep on being with me, all right? Thank you all. I appreciate you. Any questions or comments? And I will be posting this and send this to you on my YouTube site, all right? I'll be posting these videos on my YouTube site, so you can go back and listen to it again, and that way also Dave can do it as well, all right? Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, brother.
Brother Tidwell, what you've gone through is part